Okay, good morning. Today we'll talk about the brain. You know that brain is a part of the central nervous system. Two organs belong to the central nervous system. One is the brain and another is the spinal cord. So today we'll talk about the brain. First, we'll see the protection of the brain, the structures that provide protection to the brain, how your brain is protected. Then we'll see the ventricles in the brain. Inside the brain, you have some cavities filled with fluid. Those fluid filled cavities are called ventricles. So we'll see the ventricles in the brain. Then we'll talk about the parts of the brain and surface marking and lobes. Then we'll talk about the white matter and gray matter. If you cut the brain and see inside, you will see the outer area is gray, which is called the gray matter, and inner area is white, called the white matter. Then we'll see different functional areas in the cerebral cortex. Now, what is the cerebral cortex? You know that the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum, right? That big part. And the outer surface of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex, outermost layer. And in the cerebral cortex or on the surface of the cerebrum, you have many functional areas, motor areas, sensory areas are present in the cerebral cortex. So we'll see important functional areas present there. Then we'll talk about an interesting thing that is called homunculi. What are homunculi? We'll see that. First, the protection of the brain. Which structures protect the brain? You know that your brain is the most important organ of the body, right? And also most delicate and sensitive organ. So it must be protected heavily. The structures protect the brain are cranial bones or skull bones, meninges, the coverings, connective tissue coverings around the brain. Watery cushion is given by the cerebrospinal fluid. Around the brain, you have the cerebrospinal fluid that also protects the brain. And then the blood-brain barrier. Blood-brain barrier is the wall or partition between the blood and the brain tissue. And blood-brain barrier is nothing but the wall of the capillaries in the brain. Because you know that inside the capillaries in the brain, you have the blood. And outside of the capillary, you have the brain tissue. So the wall of the capillary is the partition between the blood and the brain tissue, and that is the blood-brain barrier. And you have seen in last class that around the capillaries of the brain you have astrocyte layer. One type of neuroglial cell, astrocyte, forms additional layer around the capillaries. So the wall of the capillaries and astrocytes together form the blood-brain barrier, which is very important because the wall of the capillary and astrocytes together prevent many harmful chemicals from entering into the brain tissue from the blood. So it will prevent the chemicals easily enter into the brain tissue from the blood. And you know that brain tissue is very sensitive, neural tissue. So that is a protection, chemical protection given by the blood-brain barrier. Okay, now here you see the structures you will see from outside to inside before you hit the brain. First, if you start from outside, the outermost structure is the skull on the cranial bone, the thick skin. Then under that you have the periosteum. You know that periosteum is the covering of the bone. And then you have the cranial bone or skull bone. Under the skull bone you have three meninges. Outermost one is the toughest one, that is called the Dura Mater. Then middle one is the arachnoid mater, and innermost one is the pia mater. So those three meninges or coverings, connective tissue coverings, are there. In between the arachnoid mater and pia mater, you have subarachnoid space. Sub means below. So below the arachnoid mater, you have subarachnoid space, and that space contains the cerebrospinal fluid. That fluid also protects the brain, provides cushion. Okay, so those are the structures protect the brain. And you will see from outside to inside. If you go from outside to inside, those are the structures you will hit one after another. Now, this is the skull bone, okay, and the Dura Mater is thick connective tissue membrane, and it is the toughest one and thickest one. Okay, this is the Dura Mater attached to the inner surface of the bone, and then you have a space, and this is the arachnoid mater, and then you have a space, this is the pia mater. And you have seen when you did the dissection, pia mater is attached to the brain surface directly. It's difficult to separate and very thin. So this is pia, this is arachnoid, okay, and this is the thickest and toughest one, hardest one, that's the dura. Okay, Dura Mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. The space under the Dura Mater is called subdural space. That makes sense, right? Subdural space. Sometimes blood can accumulate here in this space. If any external injury occurs, for example, injury in this bone has occurred, fracture, then what will happen? Blood will accumulate here, and that is called subdural hematoma because it is in the subdural space. That's why we term that as subdural hematoma. Okay. And the cerebrospinal fluid is located here in subarachnoid space, filled with the fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so that's how the three layers are present, and you have the space in between the layers. Okay, so Dura Mater, arachnoid matter, and Dura Mater. Dura Mater is the outermost and strongest and toughest one, thickest one. Protection is the function. Arachnoid matter is separated from dura by subdural space. I have shown you here, this is the subdural space. And subarachnoid space contains the cerebrospinal fluid here. Okay. And also, a lot of blood vessels are present in the subarachnoid space, in this space. Okay, we have blood vessels. Dura Mater is the innermost one, directly attached to the surface of the brain, and it is very thin. Okay, tightly attached to the surface of the brain, difficult to separate. Now we'll talk about the ventricles of the brain. Inside the brain, you have few cavities. Those are called ventricles, and those cavities contain the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, those cavities or ventricles are connected to each other, so the fluid can easily move from one ventricle to another. And the wall of the ventricle has the ependymal cell lining. For example, this is your lateral ventricle. You have seen here. You have the ependymal type of neuroglial cells, and ependymal cells have cilia like this. Okay, so this is the ventricle, contains the cerebrospinal fluid here. Okay, and in the wall you'll see the neuroglial cells called the ependymal cells. What are the ventricles we have inside the brain? We have two lateral ventricles, one third ventricle, and one fourth ventricle. So total 4 ventricles are inside the brain. We'll see their locations here. Although the ventricles are located inside the brain, you won't be able to see from outside, but if you want to see the location inside the brain, these two pictures are showing the locations of those two ventricles inside the brain. If you see from the front like this, inside the brain, how they are located in the left side. If you see from the side, how the ventricles are located, you can see in the right side picture. Now you see two lateral horns. These two are lateral horns, and two lateral ventricles, and this is the third ventricle, and here is the fourth ventricle. If you see from the side, these two are lateral ventricles, and here is the third ventricle, and here is the fourth ventricle. Now you see the ventricles are connected to each other. The lateral ventricles are connected to the third ventricle by interventricular foramen. So here you see the interventricular foramen, and third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle by cerebral aqueduct. Okay, narrow tube-like structure, cerebral aqueduct. So why the ventricles are connected to each other? The ventricles are connected to each other to regulate the pressure inside the ventricles. if for any reason the amount of fluid increases in one ventricle, then the pressure will increase. So what will happen? The fluid will move from that ventricle to other ventricles. So the pressure will go down. So to maintain or regulate the pressure inside the ventricles, they are connected to each other. Now there is a clinical condition that is called hydrocephalus. Have you heard that? Hydrocephalus, hydro means water or fluid. Cephalic part is the head part. Cephalic part of the body is called the head part. Now, hydrocephalus is a condition in which a lot of fluid accumulates inside the ventricles. That's why it is called hydrocephalus, fluid in the head. Why that happens? Most of the cases, what happens? Tumor around the ventricles causes the hydrocephalus. For example, you see here, if any tumor grows here, the tumor will do what? Will press the interventricular foramen and close this channel. So in that case, what will happen? More fluid will accumulate inside the ventricles, and gradually, as the fluid will start to accumulate, the brain will start to get bigger. Make sense? If more fluid accumulates inside the ventricles, then brain will start to get bigger.
So all the ventricles or mainly the lateral ventricles?
Depends where the tumor is, right? So the brain will expand, and if the brain expands in infants, you know that in infants the cranial bones are still growing, right? You will see the spaces in between the cranial bones. So the skull will also expand because it is flexible. So when the brain will expand, the skull will get bigger. So the head will look big. Make sense? In infants. But if it happens in adults, you know that already the cranial bones are fused. That's sutures, right? You cannot expand anymore. So in that case, you won't see the expansion of the skull. That's why we see bigger head in infants in hydrocephalus. But it doesn't mean that hydrocephalus only occurs in infants. It can occur in anybody, right? But in case of adults, you won't see the expansion of the skull. So which is more dangerous? What do you think? Adults, because intracranial pressure will increase, right? A lot, because brain will not get enough space, room to expand, but the pressure will build up inside the brain. In infants, you can easily diagnose by seeing the growth of the skull, right? And you can treat. First thing, what you have to do, you have to reduce the pressure by removing the fluid from there. You can insert needles, sharp needle inside the ventricle and remove. And of course, you have to remove the tumor to reduce the pressure there. Okay, so that is hydrocephalus. So you need to know what are the ventricles you have and how the ventricles are connected to each other and what is hydrocephalus. Sources and functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is secreted in the ventricles from a plexus of capillaries that is called choroid plexus, and choroid plexus is actually attached to the roof of the ventricles here. So this is the choroid plexus. Okay, choroid plexus. And from the choroid plexus, the cerebrospinal fluid is secreted into the ventricle. Okay. Yes.
So is the choroid plexus on the arachnoid layer?
This is completely a different thing. Here is your brain, and here is the ventricle. We
Oh,
are
you're
talking about here.
sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So choroid plexus is attached to the roof of the ventricles, and it is a special type of capillary plexus that secretes the cerebrospinal fluid inside the ventricles. And then from the ventricles, the fluid goes to the subarachnoid space. Okay, so remember, from the ventricle, the fluid enter into the subarachnoid space, because we know that those are the two locations where you will find the cerebrospinal fluid, right? One is in the subarachnoid space and another is inside the ventricles of the brain. Functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. Number one is cushioning. You know that brain is a very delicate organ, and if there was no cerebrospinal fluid around the brain, we all the time we move our head, right? Our head is moving all the time. Particularly when you drive, if you suddenly stop the car, right? Your head moves suddenly. When you ride in roller coasters, in Six Flags, right? You have seen how fast quickly the roller coasters moves. So your head is moving suddenly in all different directions. So if there was no cerebrospinal fluid, what would have happened? The soft brain would have hit the skull every time, and that would cause the damage of the brain. That doesn't happen because of the presence of the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Um, so gives bouncy to the cerebrospinal central nervous system organs, that is brain and the spinal cord, protects the central nervous system from blows and other trauma, and another is provides nutrition to the brain tissue, because cerebrospinal fluid contains the nutrients and other chemicals that will keep the brain tissue healthy. Okay, so here you see the choroid plexus attached to the wall of the ventricle, that red structure, and from there the cerebrospinal fluid is secreted. Now, after secretion of cerebrospinal fluid, first it enters into the ventricles, and then from the ventricles the cerebrospinal fluid goes to the subarachnoid space around the brain and the spinal cord. So you see how the fluid moves. From the ventricles, the cerebrospinal fluid will go around the brain, the subarachnoid space. Okay? Around the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, parts of the brain. The brain is divided into four parts. What are those? First part is the largest part of the brain, that is called the cerebrum. So the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum. It consists of two hemispheres. Okay, two hemispheres. Then another part of the brain is called the cerebellum. Okay, located posterior and inferior of the cerebrum. That means behind and slightly below the cerebrum. And then another structure is the brain stem. Brainstem has three parts, three structures: midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Okay, so those three structures together form the brainstem: midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And then the diencephalon. That's the last part. Okay. These three parts you can see from outside. You can see the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. It's like a sphere separated by the longitudinal fissure into two hemispheres, right and left. Cerebellum you can see outside, from outside. Brainstem you can see from outside, but diencephalon is inside. Now, diencephalon consists of three structures: thalamus, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland. Okay, so those three structures belong to diencephalon. Now, I'll just briefly mention the function of each of those four structures. Cerebrum. The surface of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex. So this is the cerebrum, and outermost layer or the surface is called the cortex, cerebral cortex. And in the cerebral cortex, you have many functional areas are present. For example, if this is the back of the brain, you have the visual area here. Here you have motor area, primary motor, primary somatosensory. So just know that many functional areas are located in the cerebral cortex. We'll see the important functional areas later. Just know that that's the function of the cerebrum. Important functional areas are present in the cortex. Cerebellum. Main function of cerebellum is maintaining the balance and equilibrium. Maintaining the balance and equilibrium of your body. When you walk, when you run, right? When you stand up, your body balance is maintained, and that is mainly controlled by the cerebellum. You have seen, have you ever seen circus? Did you go to circus? Sometimes you'll see girls walk on the rope, right? Chinese girls are very good in maintaining balance. Right? So they're very good in maintaining the balance. If you practice from your childhood, the cerebellum will develop better than other people. Okay, so you can control the body balance much better. So balance and equilibrium. Brainstem. In your midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, you have important regulatory centers present. For example, your cardiac centers, your respiratory centers. Those important regulatory centers are present in the brainstem. You know that cardiac center regulates the heart. Respiratory centers regulate the respiration, breathing, right? So those are very vital functions. Then diencephalon, thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary gland. Thalamus is called the major sensory relay station. Major sensory relay station is the thalamus. Why it is called the major sensory relay station? Because almost all sensory signals are relayed there, relayed in the thalamus. What are the sensory signals? Those signals go towards the brain, right? Your visual signal, sensory input, right? You remember in last class I explained sensory, auditory, touch, pain, temperature, all those are sensory signals. They will go to thalamus and will be relayed there, will be processed there. Then hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a very important structure. It performs several important functions. I just mentioned few. One is hypothalamus regulates body temperature. Regulates food and water intake. Hypothalamus regulates the pituitary gland. Pituitary secretion. Okay, so regulates body temperature, regulates food and water intake, regulates the pituitary secretion. So those are few important functions of the hypothalamus. Now, how hypothalamus regulates the body temperature? When your body temperature increases, hypothalamus sends signal to the sweat glands to release sweat. So sweat will take the heat out. Also, hypothalamus sends signal to the blood vessels of your skin and cause the vasodilatation. So more blood will flow and heat will get out. How hypothalamus controls the food and water intake? You know, when you are hungry, you start eating, right? And then after a few minutes, what happens? You start to lose interest. I'm done. I'm no more hungry, right? So at one point you stop. Who inhibits you from eating or drinking? If you are thirsty, you think I will drink a lot of water, right? Then after you drink 1 or 2 glasses, then you said I am enough, done, right? I'm saturated. So who is inhibiting? Your hypothalamus inhibits the further eating and drinking. Okay. Now there are clinical conditions in which hypothalamus, if the hypothalamus function is disrupted, changed, then what happens? The food and drinking habit changes. You will see some people get very big gain weight because one reason could be abnormal hypothalamic functions. Okay. Okay, so here you see those parts of the brain. Cerebrum. You are looking from the side, so you can see one hemisphere. Then posterior and inferior of the cerebrum, you have the cerebellum. And then inside the brain, you have diencephalon, which consists of the thalamus, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland. This is the thalamus. I did show you to draw an egg. Thalamus. This area is hypothalamus, and this is the pituitary gland. Then the green part is the brain stem, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Okay, so those are the parts. Now we'll see the cerebral hemispheres. on the surface of the cerebral hemisphere, you have seen the sulci and fissures. On the surface of the cerebrum or cerebral hemisphere, you'll see many shallow grooves, look like lines, and those shallow grooves are called sulci. They contain blood vessels. Now, sulci is plural. If I indicate one shallow groove, that is a sulcus. In between two sulci, the area is called a gyrus. So, you have many sulci and many gyri on the surface of the cerebrum or cerebral hemisphere. Also, we have few deep cuts or grooves, like deep cuts in the brain. Those are called fissures. So fissures are deep grooves or cuts, and sulci are shallow. So if I draw here, it will be like this. If this is the brain surface, and if I see a deep one, okay, so these are sulci. In between two sulci, the area is called a gyrus. Okay, sulcus, fissure. Okay, so the largest fissure is the longitudinal fissure along the midline, mid-sagittal plane, and that fissure, longitudinal fissure, separates two hemispheres, and in between the cerebrum and cerebellum you have another fissure that is called the transverse fissure that separates the cerebrum and cerebellum. Now, in each hemisphere of the brain, you have 4 lobes. Some books say 4 books. Some books said five lobes. Some books said 4 lobes. I'll prefer to say 4 lobes: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. Insula is inside the brain, inside the hemisphere, and it belongs to not only one lobe. Part of it belongs to frontal lobe, part of it belongs to the temporal lobe. So we won't consider insula as a separate lobe. Okay, here you see a hemisphere. Now, by 4 different colors, you can see they have shown those 4 lobes in each hemisphere. Frontal lobe, and behind the frontal lobe, you have the parietal lobe. Frontal and parietal are separated by a sulcus that is called the central sulcus. You need to know this. Central sulcus separates the frontal and parietal lobes. Then the parietal and occipital lobes are separated by parieto-occipital sulcus. So this is very easy. Parieto-occipital sulcus. Then the temporal lobe is separated from the lobes above. That means from the frontal and parietal lobe by the lateral sulcus. So those are the sulci separate the lobes. Now, why central sulcus is important? Because you see in front of the central sulcus the long gyrus, the red one. just in front of the central sulcus. That is called precentral gyrus. Pre means before, right? Post means after. So precentral gyrus in front of the central sulcus, and that gyrus is also called the primary motor cortex. Primary motor cortex. That means that is the main motor area in the brain. So what's the function of motor area? Movement, right? Main motor function is the movement of the skeletal muscles, movement of the body parts. So that primary motor area or precentral gyrus controls the movement of the body. Behind the central sulcus, you see that long blue gyrus, that is called the post-central gyrus. Post means after, right? Behind. This gyrus is called the primary somatosensory cortex. Primary somatosensory area or cortex. And this area receives the somatosensory signals. This area receives the somatosensations. So what are the somatosensory signals or somatosensations? Pain, touch, temperature, those feelings you feel in the body surface. Pain, pressure, touch, temperature, those are somatosensations, and those signals will go to that area and will be processed there. So if you put an electrode in somatosensory area and record the activity of the area, you'll see after you put the electrode, if you touch the skin, okay, you'll see the neurons get excited in that area. That means the signal from your skin is going there, right? Signal is going there to excite that area. When you move your body parts, you'll see the activity increases in precentral gyrus, primary motor cortex. Okay, so those are two important functional areas. Also, on the surface of the cerebrum, you have many sulci and gyri. You can see that. Now, if you cut the cerebrum, as I showed you here, the outer part is called the cortex, inner part is called the medulla, or outer part is the gray matter and inner part is the white matter, because this area is gray, this area is white. Now you already know why some areas are gray, why some areas are white. I showed you before. In gray area, you will find many cell bodies. So in gray matter, you have the cell bodies of the neurons, right? And in white matter area, you have the myelinated fibers, like this. Okay, makes sense? So inside the cell bodies, you have the micelle granules, right, and dendrites here. So that's why this area is gray and this area is white. Okay. That means in the cortex, you have the cell bodies of the neurons. Insula is in the inner part of the cerebrum, and a part of it is in the frontal cortex, part of it is in the temporal cortex. So we won't consider that as a separate lobe. Now, what are the important functional areas you have in the cerebral cortex? First, let's see the occipital lobe all the way back. In the occipital lobe, you have the primary visual cortex all the way in the back of the occipital lobe. You have the primary visual cortex where the visual signal is processed. Whatever you see, that picture is processed there. And around the primary visual cortex, you have other visual areas. Those are called visual association areas. Other visual areas. So, occipital lobe is mostly for visual signal processing. I have already mentioned the precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus, primary motor cortex and primary somatosensory cortex, right? Separated by the central sulcus. So if I ask you the question that precentral gyrus or primary motor cortex is located in which lobe, what do you think? Frontal. All the way back of the frontal lobe, right? Postcentral gyrus, which is also called primary somatosensory cortex, is located in which lobe? Parietal. All the way the front of the parietal lobe. Front part of the parietal lobe. Remember that. Now, if you see the temporal lobe in the very upper part of the temporal lobe, near the lateral sulcus, you have the primary auditory cortex. And around the primary auditory cortex, you have the auditory association cortex or area. Okay? So, auditory signal will go there from your ear. The sound signal will be processed there in the very upper part of the temporal lobe near the lateral sulcus. Then, if you see in the middle of the frontal lobe, in the center of the frontal lobe, there is an area that is called the Broca's area, shown by the dotted line. The Broca's area is also known as speech area. Why? Because this area sends signal to the vocal cords when you produce speech. Okay, so that's the speech area or Broca's area. The name Broca's came from a French neurologist who had a patient. So Dr. Broca's, he had a patient who had been suffering from difficulty in speech production. He couldn't produce speech. He had difficulty in producing speech. So after the patient died, Dr. Broca's, he removed his brain and studied under the microscope every area, and he found that in that area, particular area, there was a lesion. Make sense? There was a lesion in that area. So he first proposed that that area is responsible for the production of speech. Then later many other scientists have proved that yes, that area is responsible for the production of speech. So that's the Broca's area, production of speech. Now you see another area, part of it in the parietal cortex and part of it in the temporal parietal lobe, part of it in the parietal lobe. That dotted area is called the Wernicke's area. And this area, Wernicke's area, is responsible for understanding the speech. So one is for the production of speech, another is for the understanding of the speech. Completely different function. Like, if I want to say something, that's the production, right? Production of speech. That is controlled by Broca's area. Now, if you say something to me, then I have to understand that, right? What you are saying. Did you get it? Looks like are you getting it?
I get it. I was wondering though, I mean, in theory, could a person they not understand speech but be able to produce it?
Yeah, definitely, because two different areas.
Okay.
You can produce a speech, but you may not understand others' speech, and it happens. Yeah, if you destroy the Broca's area, you would have difficulty in producing speech because signal is not going to your vocal cord. Make sense?
So then, could you understand your own speech if you were producing it?
If you can produce again, of course, but if it is destroyed, you cannot. There is a very little chance that you can produce again. But definitely, your understanding area is normal, so you will understand everything clearly. Okay, but you won't be able to produce. Okay. So two different areas, but both are related to speech. One is production, another is understanding.
There is both the parietal and the temporal.
Yeah, part of it in parietal, upper part, and lower part is in the temporal lobe. Now, the most anterior part of the frontal lobe is responsible for higher brain functions. What are the higher brain functions? The most front part of the frontal lobe here. That entire area is responsible for higher brain functions. We also say higher order brain functions. What are those? Intelligence, emotion, okay, judgment. So those are called higher order brain functions. What are the then lower brain functions? What do you think? Yes, good. No intelligence is there, right? Like your defecation reflex, urinary reflex. Those are controlled by lower areas. And we do those every day. Everybody does. But critical thinking, intelligence, emotion, judgment, logics, those things are processed in the front part of the frontal lobe.
What controls the lower brain function?
Brain stem or yeah, mostly brain stem. Reflexes. Okay. Now, in the cerebral cortex, you have many areas. I have just mentioned few of those. Some of those areas are sensory areas. Some of those areas are motor areas, and some are called association areas. Sensory areas are visual area, right? Because visual signal is sensory signal going to the brain. Auditory signal is sensory signal. Pain, touch, temperature, those are all sensory signals going towards the brain. So the areas for those are sensory areas. For example, primary somatosensory cortex processes pain, touch, temperature. Primary visual, primary auditory. Those are purely sensory areas. Motor areas. Can you name motor area? What are the motor areas? Precentral, gyrus, right? That's the primary motor cortex, right? So that is a big motor area there. Anything else you think motor? Just think that motor will get out from the brain, sensory will get in, right? So another area I have mentioned will go to the vocal cord, send signal to the vocal cord, Broca's area, to produce the speech, right? So that must be motor because the signal is going to the vocal cord, right? It is controlling the vocal cord. So those are motor areas. So you see some areas are sensory areas, some areas are motor areas. Now also you have association areas where the sensory and motor or multiple sensory or multiple motor functions are combined together. So association, the word association means combining, right? Putting together. So the association areas combine or put different functions together. Put different functions together. So you have some association areas. Why you need the association areas? You see, just think this way. When I am talking, you are looking at me, you are seeing me, right? What I am doing. That is visual, going to the primary visual cortex, right? At the same time, you are listening what I am saying, right? So that signal is going this way to the primary auditory cortex. Make sense? Your auditory cortex is here, your visual cortex is here, right? They are far away. But there is an area where those two signals are combined together. Otherwise, it will not make sense. Because if you see me, I am moving my mouth, and sound is coming from that skull, cranial, that skeleton. Would it make sense? You'll get confused, right? What's going on? So, if they function separately, there is no way your brain will know what is going on. So, there are areas where two or more functional areas are combined and make sense. Yes.
So like that, does their association areas not work as well? Like they can't put what they're hearing and they're seeing together, they can really see, they can feel it together.
Yeah, definitely the association area is not getting signal from the auditory area. So association is not occurring there correctly. Make sense? But if someone is, we have seen that blind from childhood, the auditory area gets bigger, more powerful. Okay, that is the plasticity. The brain has the plasticity. Okay, it can change a little bit. Okay, now we know that in the cerebrum, outer part is the cortex, which is the gray matter, and inner part is the white matter. But in the brainstem, that means midbrain, pons, medulla, and in the spinal cord, it is opposite. The outer area is the white matter and inner area is the gray matter. Okay, so it's opposite in the brainstem and spinal cord. If you see the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, if you cut along the longitudinal fissure and separate, this is the medial view of the hemisphere. What are the structures you will see here? You will see a white band above the lateral ventricle that is called the corpus callosum. This structure connects two hemispheres together, holds two hemispheres together. And why corpus callosum is important? Because you see here, through the corpus callosum, the fibers. Corpus callosum is filled with fibers, and the fibers are going like this. From this hemisphere, the fibers are going to that hemisphere, and from this hemisphere, fibers are going to the other hemisphere. So this is the corpus callosum. So inside the corpus callosum, you have the fibers, and the fibers are going from one hemisphere to the other. So like this. So the hemispheres can quickly talk to each other because of the corpus callosum. The fibers through the corpus callosum, they can talk to each other, communicate each other quickly. You know that you have two eyes, right? You have two visual areas because you have two hemispheres. Make sense? So two visual areas must talk to each other because each is getting signal from most of the signal from each eye. So they must talk to each other. You have two auditory cortexes, right? So they need to talk to each other to give you the entire perception. So you need the cerebral hemispheres to talk to each other, and the fibers are sending signal from one side to another side, and those fibers pass through the corpus callosum. Here you can see the lateral ventricle under the corpus callosum, and then you can see the fornix, that thin belt, and this is the thalamus, primary sensory relay station, the thalamus, and you see the olfactory bulb, olfactory tract. In human, the olfactory bulb is not very big, but in some creatures, the olfactory bulb is much bigger. Although the brain is small, but olfactory bulb is bigger. Those animals, for example, use their olfaction a lot. Their olfactory bulb is bigger, and that makes sense, right? Because they use the smell for their survival. Many creatures. So depending on which function you use more, that area is bigger. Homunculus. What is homunculus? Homunculus is singular, homunculi is plural, like sulcus and sulci, gyrus and gyri. Homunculi are the entire body maps in the brain. Homunculus is the entire body map in the brain. That means in your brain you have your entire body map. This map is not proportionate to the body size. So disproportionate body map or unproportionate body map in the brain. So I am repeating again, homunculus is an unproportionate body map in the brain. Now you see here you have two homunculi. One body map is present in the primary somatosensory cortex, that is the postcentral gyrus, and another homunculus or body map is present in the primary motor cortex, which is the precentral gyrus. You already know those gyri. So you have two body maps or homunculi. Here the blue one is showing the primary somatosensory cortex, that is the postcentral gyrus, and you see different parts of this gyrus receives signal from different body areas, and that is the map. So here, this part of primary somatosensory cortex receives signal from the foot, this part from the thigh, this part from the trunk of the body. Okay, this part is the arm and forearm, and this big area is for hand. So you see, this is a disproportionate map because your hand is smaller than your arm and forearm together, right? But for the hand, the area in the brain is bigger than this. Make sense? So this is the disproportionate map. Why is that? Why the area is not proportionate to the size of your body parts? Any idea?
We have more sensors.
Yeah, we have more sensory receptors. We use the hand more to feel the things, right? To touch the things and feel the things. Okay, so that is the use dependent expansion. You need more neurons to receive signal from your hand because you have more receptors and you use more, right? So you need more neurons there. So to accommodate more neurons, that area gets bigger. Is it make sense? Okay. Now I did a research like 10 years ago for a few years on raccoons. Have you seen raccoon? 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 Yeah. Okay. So raccoons use these fingers a lot, right? So these finger areas are very big in their primary somatosensory cortex because they use all the time. And what I did, I surgically denervated, for example, this index finger, cut the nerve here, okay? So signal will not go to that area of the brain. Make sense? And what I have seen within few weeks, that area was taken by the other areas. That means adjacent areas. This area and this area in the brain, that area is taken. That means these areas got bigger, right? This area shrinks and eventually disappears. So that is the plasticity in the brain. In some areas, you have huge plasticity. You can see that. Okay, it happens very fast. So somatosensory cortex has huge plasticity, and there are several studies, interesting studies. The people, they use the fingers to play piano, like someone plays piano for 30 years from childhood. Okay, we have seen that these finger areas expand because use dependent. You use these fingers more. Okay, so this is very interesting, and that's why the homunculus is a disproportionate map. The word homunculus means dwarf. You know dwarf? Small guy. So if you put all these parts together now, you will see a person looks like a dwarf person, right? Trunk is small, head is big. So that is the homunculus, yeah.
So everyone's homunculi is individual.
Yes,
Depending
definitely.
on what you do.
Yeah, slight variation. But in general, we all use the hands more, right? So similar, but definitely slightly different from each other.
Year on
Second,
it. It's not a year.
there's no ear. They did not show every small parts, but definitely the ear area, I believe, within the head area. Similar map is present in the primary motor cortex. This is called motor homunculus. Again, those areas we use more need more neurons. That means more area. Okay.